Good afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome to the Washington Institute. I'm Rob Satloff, the director of the Institute. This is our first major policy forum of the year, and I'm delighted to welcome you and delighted to welcome people around the world watching on C-SPAN and on live stream and on all the various ways in which one can watch Washington Institute events. Thank you for joining us. If I could ask you to please make sure your phones are on mute. Feel free to tweet as much as you like, but make no noise about it. I'm delighted that we can meet at a time when the federal government is now open. There is so much on the Middle East agenda in 2019. It's good to have a government that is focused on that. I'm delighted to be joined on this panel, to be introducing a panel of three of my colleagues, two of whom have made journeys around the world in recent days, coming back to report for what they have observed and seen and learned in the Middle East, one of whom has made perhaps an even longer journey from Capitol Hill, because this is a very different environment than Capitol Hill. And I'll introduce all three of them in just a moment. Just a brief introductory word. Historian by training, so I tend to see things in historical perspective. It is, I think, useful to note three things so far as we enter 2019. We are now 2 years into an experiment in which both American political parties, for the first time since World War II, now essentially argue for diminished American role in the Middle East. We are now 10 years into an experiment in which two successive presidents argue for a diminished American role in the Middle East. We're going to talk about whether this is good or bad, right or wrong, the implications of this, but I think it is important at least to lay that out. And the third point I would make, as we now enter the third year of the Trump administration, for all the high anxiety that we have witnessed in the last 2 years, we actually haven't yet had the Middle East crisis that presidents almost inevitably come to face. One can go back to presidents in your lifetime, and they've all faced some major crisis. We haven't had that yet. And as you look at our system, as you look at the people, the institutions, the administration of how we are addressing problems, preparing options, identifying solutions, executing decisions, keep that in the back of your mind, that we haven't yet had the crisis. With that, I'm very pleased to introduce my colleagues. Speaking first is Ambassador Barbara Leaf. Barbara joined the Institute last year after completing service in the State Department, a very distinguished career of diplomatic service that ended as with a tour as the American ambassador to the United Arab Emirates. Previously, Barbara had served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State on 2 occasions, knows the region better, certainly better than almost any person that I have ever met, and I'm really delighted to have her as a colleague here at the Washington Institute. Speaking after Barbara will be Ambassador Dennis Ross. Dennis, as you know, has more than a quarter century experience in a rare way of experience in the sense that he has served White House tours for both Democratic and Republican presidents. You don't see that much of that level of bipartisanship in one person's professional career much anymore. Dennis served most recently in the Obama administration, and I'm delighted that he's with us after returning from his own several weeks abroad in Israel with other travels around the region. And at the far end of the table, I'm I'm thrilled to be able to welcome for her first Policy Forum presentation here at the Washington Institute, my newest colleague, Dana Struhl. Dana joins the Institute after service on Capitol Hill, where she was the senior professional staff member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on the Democratic side. Previously, she had service in the Pentagon, and so knows both ends of the executive and legislative branches. And I'm thrilled that she's with us, offering special insight, not just on the traditional policy matters that our staff focuses on, but also making sure that we fully understand and appreciate the complexities of Capitol Hill. So with that, I'll turn the floor over to Barbara. Barbara?
Thanks very much, Rob. Good afternoon, everyone. Well, I might take issue with one of the things that you asked us to think about, but I'll wait till the end of my 8 to 9 minutes to do so. I came back a week or so ago from 10 days in Saudi Arabia, and I wanted to give you just a sense of the atmospherics, the conversations that I had moving between Dhahran, Riyadh, and Jeddah with a group of international businessmen and women, and with a set of largely private Saudi engagements, private sector Saudi businessmen and women, some government engagements, but largely of a sort of economic policy orientation, but lots of engagements with private Saudis cross-generationally, and give you a sense of what I found there. And I would just start by saying that my first visit to the kingdom, was March of 1990, when I was assigned in Jerusalem, and I was anticipating an assignment back in Washington, and our embassy asked me to come over and do a tour around Saudi Arabia. So I went to the same 3 cities, and needless to say, it's a very different Saudi Arabia that I found. And I have been going at regular intervals over the succeeding years, as recently as January of 17. But what I found was really almost disorienting, just visually. So the social change is real, it's visible. The gender segregation in the public arena is just simply dissolving almost in front of your own eyes. And women, Saudi women, are visible, literally visible in the public space in a way that I've never seen. Heretofore, you would see Saudi women fully cloaked, garbed, or you just didn't see them in most places. You certainly didn't see them in ministries, government spaces, and you really, by and large, didn't see them in the workspace, except for some real niche sectors that were opened up under former King Abdullah to women. I mean, so uncovered hair, just shocking. If you haven't been to Saudi Arabia, and I was traveling with a group by and large that had not, it became very difficult to explain why all this was so extraordinary, because this was a group that had traveled all over the Middle East, so what's the big deal? I was just staggered. And of course, you've read about, but you have to, again, experience it to believe it, or experience the old Saudi Arabia of just 2-3 years ago, you know, canned music, you know, piped through restaurants, totally integrated restaurants and shopping malls and so forth, public entertainment, and then women in the workplace all over. So it was really quite striking. But then in going into these discussions with Saudi men and women, and I'm focusing on the social aspect and this desegregation aspect because it is having such a profound psychological effect on Saudis themselves. All of them having grown up in a Saudi Arabia that was so affirmatively closed. Of course, you had Starbucks on every corner and so forth, but you didn't have, essentially from the 1980s on in particular, you had a closing off of a lot of the more nefarious Western influences, and music and entertainment, films, etc., would just have been unknown to the generation since 1979. What I found was that this is unsettling to Saudis. Now, I will caveat my remarks by saying, as one young Saudi woman said to me the first evening, in her father's home, well, what do you think now that you've met the 1%, meaning herself and all of the people we were seeing? And indeed, this was by and large Western-oriented, Western-educated, their children Western-educated, and of course, heavily vested in relations with the West and the U.S. in particular. But even all of these avid proponents of these changes, socioeconomic changes that are represented in what's known as Vision 2030, the National Transformation Plan, it's disorienting to them. And I found some of the 40-something men in particular said they would have a physical shock every time they walked into a cafe, sat down and looked over and saw a bunch of Saudi women sitting next to them, and they jumped. There's sort of still a twitching apparent with people that is a leftover of having the Mutaween, the religious police, 2 years ago, only very active in keeping things segregated and locked down. Interestingly, no discussion as yet of integration of the public education system. Now, there is, of course, one jewel of a university in the Saudis' eyes, KAUST, which is King Abdullah project that is integrated, but by and large there seems to be no real discussion, and even several Saudis said to me that they couldn't imagine integrating the educational system, at least below university at this point. On the issue of how avidly are these reforms, and I'm not talking only about the social, but the social changes are quite shocking, as I said, for many, even those who are enjoying them. To my question, which I put repeatedly to literally every Saudi I met, where is their opposition to all of this? I got an amazing diversity of replies. One young woman said to me adamantly, "We have the most deeply polarized society you can't imagine." And I said, "I'm American. I know all about polarization." And she said, "No, really, it's deeply polarized over this issue of the reforms." And I said, "For instance, what's percentage supports and doesn't?" She says, "Oh, it's 50-50. I just ran that proposition with with virtually all the Saudis I talked to, and the answers, if they were 40 and below, they said, look, demographics are on our side. 70% of us are 35 or under. We all love this. And I said, well, not every 22-year-old is the same as another 22-year-old. Yeah, but by and large, we all love it. And those who object to it, they're just being squeezed away. One 40-something businessman that I asked about this said, look, at any given point, there are 3,000 people, 3,000 government employees sifting through on a daily basis social media to sort of track public opinion. I said, fair enough, but not all of the naysayers are going to be on Twitter. He said, true enough, but we have really heavy-duty surveillance to track that. The government buys the best that Israel has to offer in technology. That is a quote. He said it very matter-of-factly. I found a really interesting theme throughout these comments of the irreversibility of these changes, that they were irreversible, side by side with comments that made it clear that so many of these speakers felt that the reform project itself is inseparable from Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince's staying in power. There was a highly charged sense of defensiveness on the part of this Western-educated, oriented elites, across generations, an acute sensibility or sensitivity to the fact that there is just a huge amount of international opprobrium heaped, directed at the kingdom. And there was frustration about this point, and I'll disaggregate some of the points, but one woman in her 40s said, look, I've spent my whole life being told by Westerners, by Americans, you people are so medieval, especially with your women's situation. And she said, now we're changing, and we're really changing. It's fundamental. And we're being told, yeah, you're changing at a glacial pace. So she said, which is it? And, why don't you support us? Why don't you help us out on this? On reform in general, I got some interesting quotes. I'll give you a sense of that. once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to self-transform. We're unlikely to have another chance. I'm so happy these changes are happening, but I feel so angry, frustrated, regretful that I or the government wasted 20 or 30 years of my youth in this very closed society. To the issue of the current unpleasantness between Washington and Riyadh, is this, and specifically the congressional reaction, really about us, or is it anti-Trump? And then interesting comments about their own sense of what sort of the truth of what the way Saudi Arabia was looked at over decades. We used to have a false sense of accomplishment about proselytizing and converting to Wahhabism, to severe form of Islam, the rest of the Muslim world, and that's not good enough. Others said, you know, it's the ability to dream now. That's the importance of the last 2 years of reform. I can finally see something. I can see my country and what it's supposed to represent, and I'm seeing it through the eyes of my children. On MBS himself, look, he came to the job with no bills to pay. He owes no one anything. He owes nothing to any clique. He's willing to rock the boat, upset the status quo, take the responsibility. The previous approach to reform was retail and slow. He's all about going wholesale. And he's the first person to confront things head on in Saudi society and not sugarcoat it. So that is my sense of things in the kingdom, admittedly from a slice of a certain part of the society, but it is really unlike anything I've seen in years of going to the kingdom. I will just spend one or two more moments on something that Rob had asked us to think about, which is sort of trends in the region and kind of prospects for 2019. Well, I will say, not only from this trip, but from lots of other soundings I've done, including last fall in the Gulf, there is a deepening sense of doubt and concern, even anxiety among our closest U.S. partners about U.S. commitment to the region. Partners are hedging, or they're going full-on past hedging to take up policies and relationships that are clearly at odds with where we would like them to be. And we have that in the Gulf with a rush for an unconditional rapprochement with Bashar al-Assad. And we have the sense with Israel having a sense of having to go it alone in terms of dealing with Iran in Syria. I will say, as a former foreign policy practitioner, what is alarming to me and what is also reflected in these conversations is a thinning out of key U.S. bilateral relationships in the region. Lack of ambassadors in 12 of 18 of our embassies, or in 12 of 18 relationships, constant turnover back here in Washington at the cabinet level, in the national security community, paucity of high-level engagement, two-way. And then, finally, what was remarked on during the trip, but also in my previous engagements, who really speaks for the administration? And I think that really came to a head in December over the president's announcement of the troop withdrawal from Syria, and in the follow-up trip that National Security Advisor Bolton did to Israel and Turkey, when you had just completely contradictory messaging coming out at senior-most levels. Key developments in the face of all of this, what I see right now is the prospect for the bilateral U.S.-Saudi relationship really heading into the deep freeze for a variety of reasons. Congressional, I think Dana is going to address that, but also because I think structurally there's some real problems with the way Washington is carrying out the relationship. And that would be, one of the things that has got to change if we're going to be able to pull the relationship in the direction it needs to go. Yemen, slow unraveling, notwithstanding the UN process, unless the administration really gets serious and gets engaged there. And Iraq, I think the troops issue is going to become toxic very fast inside Iraq, and it will have reverberations back here, and we could see a replay of 2011. And with that cheery note, I will turn it over to you, Dennis.
Thank you, Barbara. I'm going to compliment a lot of, both in a positive sense and then also in terms of a division of labor, I'm going to complement a lot of what Barbara was describing. I made 2 trips to Abu Dhabi and Dubai to speak at conferences a little over, I guess, 6 weeks ago. And then I went to Israel, and then I went from Israel to Saudi Arabia, and then I came back to Israel. And I want to talk about broad impressions that I had from those conversations. In Abu Dhabi and Dubai, I did see a number of Saudis, both official and non-official Saudis, and then when I was in Saudi Arabia, I was there primarily seeing official Saudis. I would start with one general observation. The point that Barbara made about questioning where the U.S. is something that comes through both in my trips to Abu Dhabi and Dubai and Saudi Arabia and Israel. And I would even cast it a little bit differently. Questions I got actually everywhere was really maybe Trump is not an exemption. Trump seems a lot like Obama to us in terms of not wanting to be in the region, not equating the two, but saying that basically we wonder whether the U.S. really wants to be in the Middle East and whether what we're seeing now is a new normal. And I just put that out as a kind of reality that you get when you're in the region. In Saudi Arabia itself, and with Saudis that I spoke to both prior to being there and then when I got there, what I found was a kind of interesting mood. Initially, when I was first seeing Saudis in the Emirates, they were quite shaken by the effect of Khashoggi, the international reaction to it. There was a desire to sort of get out from under this. There was a feeling of great discomfort that as one person said to me, we haven't felt this way since 9/11. They really wanted to get over it. 3 weeks later, when I went to Saudi Arabia, I found a mood that was really different. And it was much more, I would say, reflective of a kind of anger. There was one of the things I think you have to recognize is Mohammed bin Salman has been seeking to replace Wahhabism with a different form of legitimacy. And the form of legitimacy, the new pillar of legitimacy, is not just modernization, but nationalism. And when you make nationalism the form of identity, well, when the outside world seems to be ganging up on you, what a shock that it produces a backlash. But that's exactly what I found when I was there. A very strong sense of Saudi Arabia being singled out unfairly, and in a sense, a kind of coalescence, a kind of circling of the wagons. That was especially true as it related to Mohammed bin Salman. I found a range of opinions about whether or not there should be some, senior counselors to him, some checks and balances, but where there was no range of opinion on his centrality to the changes taking place in Saudi Arabia. And if anybody thought that if you somehow could succeed in pushing him out, which they didn't think you could, but if you could, the dark forces in Saudi Arabia would be back. Anyone who thought that somehow this move towards transformation of Saudi Arabia would continue if he wasn't there was engaging in an illusion that this was not possible. And if you want to see the transformation continue, then in fact he has to be kind of the focal point of this. I found at the same time, while there was this kind of anger, at least among officialdom, I found this very sort of sober sense that, okay, we got a problem with the United States. We know it's not going to go away right away. We realize what's going on in the Congress. We're not happy about it, but we have to persevere, and we will. It'll take some time, but we will. At the same time, I found a very strong impulse towards not walking away from reform, doubling down on it, continuing to open up things within the society. I mean, the fact when I was there, the Formula One car race was there, Enrique Iglesias was there, literally to something like, 30 or 40,000 people were there observing this, and this was presented to me with, a lot of enthusiasm and also as a kind of marker as to how things are changing within Saudi Arabia. Across the board, I found, a determination just overall to press ahead with the reform process. I was told, when I raised questions about the Guardian rules, I was told, there may not be anything that is as open as the decision on women driving, but there simply are a series of steps that are just being taken as a matter of fact. So women at this point no longer have to have male approval to apply for a job, to get a loan, the same thing. Doing any kind of banking, the same thing. That more and more of what will be very practical activities, certainly commercial activities, will be made without any reference to having any kind of approval from guardian, from male relationships. The idea of pressing ahead in terms of overhauling the educational system was made to me very clearly, and again with the idea of transforming the role of education so that in fact you create a knowledge-based society. Interestingly enough, there is a standing committee now that is reviewing the overhaul of the educational system, kind of from soup to nuts, and I was told that Khalid bin Salman is on it, but also so is Mohammed Al-Issa on it, who is the Secretary General of the World Muslim League, and if anyone was paying attention last week to the article that he wrote on Holocaust Remembrance Day, to look at that article and to think that it came from someone who's a Saudi is almost hard to imagine. I have to say, Barbara, like you, my first trip to Saudi Arabia was March 1991, because I was with Baker when we went in immediately after the conclusion of the Gulf War. And so I too have been going there since that time, and it does feel like an entirely different country when you're there, and when you see someone like Mohammed Al-Issa write the things that he does, say the things that he does, you feel like you're certainly dealing with kind of a different realm. Now, I had a number of messages that I felt like I wanted to convey, and rather than conveying what I did, I'll simply say that I still think those messages I'm about to go through them, I think it's what the U.S. policy ought to be. So what are the things I would like to see the U.S. Administration pushing right now? One, I think we need to push transparency in the trials that are going to be held for those who've been accused in Saudi Arabia of carrying out the Khashoggi murder. I think the more transparent that is, it'll be at least part of a story that the Saudis can put out that they actually have a legal system that is dealing with this. A second thing I would like to see the administration push, I think the administration ought to be saying to Mohammed bin Salman, okay, the policy of trying to convince dissidents to come back to Saudi Arabia or to silence their criticism went grievously wrong. Leaders, when policies they're responsible for go grievously wrong, they assume responsibility. And you ought to assume responsibility for this. You say you're changing the policies. Okay, you're changing the policies because you know what went wrong. I would like to see, since there is clearly an effort to continue the reform process there, it's clear that the Crown Prince, I think, needs to rebrand himself again as a reformer. Hard to do that so long as the women activists are in jail. I would like to see them released. I do think that there's been and again, the administration, I think, should be pushing that. There has been a kind of conflation of the demonization of Saudi Arabia and the Crown Prince over Khashoggi with Yemen. So the story of what's going on in Yemen is, on the one hand, completely legitimate to expose the kind of starvation and the real human deprivation, but there is a reality here that the Houthis have made a major contribution to the reality in Yemen, and that story doesn't really come through. So I would like to see the Saudis go beyond what is the current UN process that is taking place in Sweden, and have the Saudis say, okay, look, even if there are violations in what's supposed to be a ceasefire in Hodeidah, we, Saudi Arabia, are prepared to declare a unilateral ceasefire throughout the country for 2 weeks. If the Houthis respond to it, it'll be extended indefinitely. And if they don't, at least you begin to transform the story and the narrative. I'd like to see the administration on the issue on the imbroglio with Qatar, I'd like the administration to basically go to both sides and say, here's a proposal to settle this, something that we really haven't done. I think with the Saudis, we could simply say, look, you know we share a lot of your concerns about Qatari behavior. We're going to make a proposal, and we want you to accept it. Obviously, I would like to see that happen. I would also like to see one other thing. I'd like to see a more systematic dialogue with the Saudi leadership, every 3 to 4 months going over mutual concerns. I think that might be a way to avoid surprises, maybe on each side, that aren't particularly welcome. So that's my kind of take and recommendations on Saudi Arabia, a quick overview of Israel. In the case of Saudi Arabia, I was there just before the president's declaration on Syria. In the case of Israel, I was there after the declaration on Syria. What I found in Israel was a sense, okay, we can deal with this. But I also found an unmistakable sense, and Barbara actually said it, I found an unmistakable sense that we are alone. Not alone in the sense that the U.S. won't support us publicly, will support us at the UN, we appreciate that. But when it comes to dealing with Iran in Syria, the Shia militias in Syria, and the Russians in Syria, Israel is completely on its own and feels that it's completely on its own. I found a sense that we can manage it, but I also found a kind of interesting context. The Russians basically have adopted a much tougher policy towards Israel since the shoot-down of their aircraft in September. The Israelis, in response to that, had greatly limited the operations that they were carrying out in Syria against the Iranian presence and the Shia militia presence. I was told explicitly that they had greatly reduced their operations. They noted that the Russians seemed to have had an effect on the Iranians as well, because the Iranians had no longer been expanding outward from the places that they were, but that they were doing more on Syrian bases, which the Israelis read as feeling that maybe the Iranians thought these were, since the Russians are there to pretty much secure Assad, that this was a way the Iranians thought they could build up their missile presence on Syrian bases, and those would be less likely to be struck. The fact is, after the declaration, the Israelis obviously decided that they were in a position where if they don't clearly establish limits, the limits won't be respected. So they, in a sense, felt more of a need to act. So in the aftermath of the declaration, the Israelis did carry out 2 strikes. Now, the interesting thing about those strikes is not that they did them and not that they were trying to reinforce the limits in the aftermath of the American declaration. In some ways, the more interesting thing is that the Iranians chose to try to respond to that with something the Israelis said they had planned for some time, which was a missile strike. And a missile strike with a very heavy payload directed at Mount Hermon, where there was a ski resort, which, had it succeeded, might have produced very significant casualties, civilian casualties, which would have produced even more from the Israelis. Now, Iron Dome succeeded in knocking down not the kind of small missiles or Katyushas or, the shorter range rockets, but this was a much larger one, and Iron Dome was effective against that as well. I raise this because, in a sense, you do have what is a vacuum, and each side is trying to establish what the rules are going to be. And in the Israeli case, when they feel that they're going to have to do more on their own, that says one thing, but the Iranians, in this case, the missile they fired was an Iranian missile, a longer-range Iranian missile with a significant payload from a Syrian base. And this is different. What you saw last February was Iran fire drones, directly, a drone, an armed drone, directly against Israel, not working through a proxy, which is normally the Iranian style. This was a graduated, elevated, more escalatory position on the Iranians, and suggests there's a trend here. Now, I flag this because if you're looking for one place where there's a potential for real escalation and a region-wide war, this is it. If, and I don't know how many of you, when we can get into it, I don't know how many of you read Nasrallah's 3-hour interview, but, he was sending his own signals with this, and again, I think it doesn't portend that he's about to launch an attack against Israel. I think, in fact, when you read it, it suggests that that's not what's the case. But it does suggest the potential for real escalation, because when they talk about covering all of Israel, when they talk about the whole resistance axis will be part of this, you can just imagine a scenario where if, in fact, a conflict emerges or erupts in Lebanon and Syria, and there's tens of thousands of rockets that are being fired against Israel, Israel will not allow the Iranians to be in a position where tens of thousands of rockets are hitting Israel. Iran sits off and feels it's somehow aloof from all this and immune from all this. Israel will hit Iran under those circumstances. So the potential for horizontal and vertical escalation is quite high, and this leads me to my concluding point. The United States may not want to be in Syria, but one of the things that this administration and even the president should be doing, we need to communicate to Putin that if in fact there isn't more containment of what the Iranians do, and here it's less about a presence, a certain kind of presence, it's actually more about a certain kind of presence. If they continue with what is this precision project with their missiles, which confronts Israel with a true strategic threat, tens of thousands of rockets that actually have precision capabilities, is something that Israel literally could not live with. That's the sort of thing, if the war becomes wider and the Israelis hit Iran, who does retaliate against because they're not really in a position to do more than what Hezbollah rockets would be doing, then you're talking about probably a response against Saudi Arabia in the Gulf. And that's the very kind of thing that could draw the United States in. So it would be wise, I think, for Putin to understand that even though this administration wants to be out, the one thing that is certain to draw us back in is this kind of a conflict, and the Russians would be wise to do much more to ensure that it doesn't happen.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
First of all, I just want to thank Rob and the Washington Institute for the warm welcome for my arduous journey over here from Capitol Hill. And second of all, please accept my apologies for the voice. I am hopefully at the tail end of fighting the cold that's going around Washington, D.C. So I want to structure my comments about what to look for in the Middle East policy realm in the new Congress into a couple sets of baskets. The first one is some observations on the structure of the new Congress, and then some expectations for what we can expect to see from the new Congress. And then I'm just going to touch on a few issues that I'm looking out for. So first of all, in terms of the structure of the new Congress, what's different from the last one is we have a divided chambers, a Democratic-controlled House and a Republican-controlled Senate. And I think this will make it exceptionally difficult for the legislative branch to fundamentally redirect or alter the trajectory of any Trump administration policies in the Middle East. In the Senate, there are two new Republican chairmen of national security committees. So Senator Jim Risch for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Jim Inhofe for the Senate Armed Services Committee. And while all of the committees on the House and the Senate side are just getting in the business of holding hearings and starting to debate legislation, given that the partial government shutdown just ended, what I think we can certainly conclude is that these two new chairmen will be markedly different in style than the previous chairman, so Senator John McCain and Senator Bob Corker. And so it sets up a different dynamic for how the Republican-controlled Senate will interact or seek to assert itself in expressing disagreements or reinforcing Trump administration policies. And on the House side, for all the national security committees, there's a transition from Republican-controlled committees to Democratic. But for all of these chairmen, they all served in the ranking member position before. So for all of these national security committees, they're now staffing up. And one interesting point for the House Foreign Affairs Committee, they have created a new subcommittee for oversight and investigations, which is an indicator of how seriously the Democratic-controlled House, especially in the foreign policy space, sees that mandate for itself. However, all of these chairmen in their new positions will, I think, encounter some challenges in working with the new, very large freshman class of Democratic members. That being said, One key takeaway from my time on Capitol Hill is when it comes to Congress in the Middle East, meaningful foreign policy legislation always required bipartisan cooperation. And as Barbara talked about in terms of understanding the hyper-partisan nature of Washington, D.C. at that time, it remains to be seen whether or not Congress can come together on meaningful standalone pieces of legislation. However, there are certain must-pass pieces of legislation, and those are places where I'll be looking over the course of 2019 to catch the mood of Congress when it comes to the Middle East. So appropriations legislation, we know that there's an agreement right now for State Department appropriations. There's been some reporting on funding levels for Egypt, withholding of some assistance for Saudi Arabia. These sorts of things gives you a sense of where Congress may be going. And the big piece of foreign policy legislation to look out for this year will be the National Defense Authorization Act. And again, this will be interesting to see whether it will be a robust piece of legislation or a skinny piece of legislation, given the fact that the Democratic-controlled House and the Republican-controlled Senate will need to come together and figure out where they can reach agreement on these issues. And then obviously it goes without saying that there's a very short window of opportunity for Congress to do anything. In this particular Congress, it's really 2019. We're heading into a presidential electoral cycle. We know that the Democratic field is already crowded, likely to be even more crowded. And by the time we get to 2020, there will be longer recesses. There will be more recesses as members go home to their home states and districts to work on that. So in terms of big pieces of time to get things done, 2019 is the year. So if we can't expect a major legislating Congress, what can we expect from this Congress? I will be looking at what sort of oversight Congress attempts to exert, and a lot of that we know is already happening in the House, where there are a lot of recruitment of staff members for the committees that have specific investigative and oversight expertise. Ways that members of Congress can assert themselves, even without standalone pieces of legislation, that would have significant potential to influence relationships and where the Trump administration may or may not want to go on certain policies. Weapon sales, assistance, and messaging bills. So weapon sales, members of Congress have keyed in, especially in recent years, to resolutions of disapproval on weapon sales. We saw this happen over and over in the last two Congresses, specifically on contentious weapon sales to Gulf countries, where members of Congress were concerned that sophisticated weapons could be used in Yemen. But what members of Congress have learned is that they can introduce special pieces of legislation and they can force debate on the Senate floor or on the House floor. I think we'll see more of this, especially if there's not significant pieces of legislation moving forward where members can express themselves. On assistance, whether it's military assistance, economic assistance, refugee assistance, police training assistance, members of Congress will seek to assert their views through imposing conditions on that assistance, requiring the executive branch to report on and make certifications on that assistance, whether it's tying the assistance to human rights certifications, political reform certifications, all of these different things. In general, my impression is that foreign governments hate conditionality and reporting requirements and find it to be exceptionally insulting. And I see no change from Congress in attempting to make its will known or its expectations known through these conditions and reporting requirements. And finally, especially in a Republican-controlled Senate, if there is less of an interest in conducting rigorous oversight, the Democratic minority, which is still relatively sizable, will find other ways to make itself known, and these could include things like holding up nominations. As Barbara noted, there's a dangerous vacuum of Senate-confirmed officials across the Middle East, which means that it's exceptionally difficult for these embassies to represent the views of Washington and have interlocutors at the same level as the host governments. Without bipartisanship to move these forward, I think it will be very difficult to rapidly fill those posts. What to look out for this year. So interestingly, despite the fact that I've said this isn't going to be a legislatively active Congress on the Middle East, and it was unclear exactly what the oversight will look like, both chambers of Congress are focusing on Middle East legislation right out the gate for foreign policy. So today, the Senate is debating S1, the Strengthening America's Security in the Middle East Act, which is actually a hodgepodge of legislation that did not become law last year and by and large had bipartisan support. So an Israel Security Assistance Act, a Jordan Defense Security Cooperation Act, a bill that would impose more sanctions on the Assad regime in Syria and those that are supporting the Assad regime, namely Russia, Iran, proxies, mercenaries, contractors, etc. And then a Combating BDS Act, which is the most controversial part of this legislation, this legislative package, and is slowing it down. Needless to say, there's a debate, and in terms of a foreign policy piece of legislation, it's the Middle East. And in the House, Chairman Engel has announced that his committee's first hearing next week will be about the Middle East. It's going to be about U.S. policy in the Arabian Peninsula, and we already know that members in the House of Representatives and in the Senate have both announced intent to introduce and push forward more Yemen and Saudi Arabia-focused legislation in the coming weeks. So even though it's unclear whether any of these bills move all the way through the legislative process and get to the president's desk for signature, what members of Congress are signaling is that to the extent that they are interested in foreign policy legislation, it's Middle East focused. Issues to look out for 2019. Israel. Divisive at this point on the Democratic side. You can see that there is a spectrum of views about the U.S.-Israel relationship on the Democratic side. There are elections coming up in Israel, and whether the outcome of those elections will be a unifying and clarifying moment for bipartisanship to be restored on the necessity, the strategic necessity of the U.S.-Israel relationship, or whether it will be divisive on the Democratic side, and what that means for the 2020 electoral cycle is something that I am looking out for. Iran, excuse me, traditionally a very bipartisan issue, where prior to the Iran nuclear agreement in the Obama administration, there was not that challenging for Congress to come together in a bipartisan, bicameral way over and over and pass successive packages of sanctions, not only related to the Iran nuclear issue, but also related to Iran's sponsorship of terrorism, its ballistic missile program, its human rights violations, et cetera, et cetera. We have largely seen that bipartisan center dissipate, not only since the JCPOA came into force, but also in the aftermath of very serious Democratic disapproval of the manner of the unilateral U.S. withdrawal from the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear agreement. Congress has been largely silent on meaningful sanctions on Iran, other than the Countering American Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, which passed in 2017, which I'm going to touch on at the end of my remarks. But largely the vote on that bill, shorthand is CATSA, was mostly a vote about Russia at the time and not about Iran. One other issue, Syria. The December announcement, the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Syria, although now there seems to be some murkiness about whether it's a conditions-based or a time-based withdrawal and when it will happen and how it will happen, has been largely unifying on the right and left in the foreign policy establishment here in Washington, D.C. However, this is an interesting issue that I am listening for, and where the president and many of the Democratic candidates who have already thrown their hat in the ring actually sound very similar. Why are troops there? Why should U.S. forces carry the burden? We can transfer this to somebody else, etc. And finally, as both Dennis and Barbara touched on, concerns across the region about U.S. retrenchment. Why should U.S. forces be across the region? What is the nature of U.S. involvement? What is the U.S. responsibility across the Middle East? We are clearly seeing governments hedge and make alternative plans because they are questioning whether or not the United States is committed to remaining the security guarantor for these countries. And as they're looking around, Moscow's obviously is looking pretty good to a lot of these governments. In the CATSA legislation, there are very clear mandatory sanctions. if governments in the Middle East purchase sophisticated weapon systems, if they sign robust agreements for commercial or intelligence sector activity, et cetera. This sets up a potential conflict in 2019 if any of these sales are consummated, whether it's Turkey purchasing a very sophisticated missile interceptor system from Russia, or many of the other governments in the Arab world that are contemplating purchases. The Trump administration will have to decide whether or not it's going to impose sanctions on these countries where the administration clearly wants to maintain robust partnerships, and Congress has set up a diametrically opposite choice. These are potentially, this is a very serious conflict area, and it remains to be seen what Congress will do. And I would just, against the backdrop of sanctions on Russia for other activities, a trade war with China, deteriorating transatlantic relationships, and now the potential for sanctioning all of the partner governments in the Middle East if they choose to pursue deeper strategic relationships with Russia, a very dangerous time for the United States. Thank you.
All right. Well, on that hopeful and happy note, thank you very much. I want to open by very briefly asking each of my colleagues a quick question based on their remarks or based on what the other colleagues might have said. Barbara, I want to ask you to expand on what I think is one of the most important things you said that was sort of buried in later in your remarks, namely about the emerging contest over American troops in Iraq. Now that we've seen where the administration at least wants to go in Syria, one can see it seems that some Iraqi politicians smell blood, and this is a big target. How important are American troops in Iraq? What do you think the future of their deployment is going to be? Where do you think the administration is going to end up on this? Dennis, I'm not going to ask you to prophesy the outcome of the Israeli election, but I do want to ask you what impact you think the electoral process, the next several months, is going to have on Israeli foreign policy decisions and decisions of others, perhaps. I mean, will the Prime Minister of Israel take certain decisions now that he sees that he might be in a neck-and-neck race with a reputable candidate with military credentials? What might that do, and how might that affect the security environment we just discussed? And then, Dana, I'd appreciate if you could address that Saudi who said to Barbara, that Yemen resolution, yes, the right and left in Congress are together, but it's as much anti-Trump, perhaps even more anti-Trump, than it is anti-Saudi Arabia. How much of what's going on in Congress is really a stalking horse for other things, such as being anti-Trump?
Okay, so I spoke in shorthand when I mentioned Iraq, but I see, and I'll quickly respond to something Danny just said because it does relate to Iraq. No, the withdrawal is not conditions-based. I'm very reliably told, as recently, this week, and from somebody who's really in a position to know. It is not conditions-based. It's just happening. Now, a lot of things are happening around it diplomatically to try to mitigate the harm and risk and so forth, including risk to our own forces. But all that said, it's happening. Now, on the other side of the border, we have Iraq, and it's a weird and eerie feeling to see emerging this sort of the dynamic that I remember vividly from 2010, 2011, which is to say an overweening, first of all, antibodies in the Iraqi body politic to foreigners, foreign troops, U.S. troops specifically, stirred, agitated a little bit by the Iranians, but really antibodies that are already alive and well. And some of those antibodies today, were guests of ours in Buqa detention facility and other places in Iraq. So they're agitated, but they are matched weirdly. Again, it's a replay of 8 to 9 years ago by a president who would be more than happy to bring him home. Now, I have been told for 2 months that the troops in Iraq are there, they're there to stay. But that's, of course, conditional upon an Iraqi government wanting them to stay. And what is the Iraqi government? It's a government that was elected last May, still doesn't have a Minister of Defense, Minister of Interior, and that's very much an internal fight among some of these same forces that have said, thank you very much, but we don't want U.S. troops. So you've just had the president announce summarily, we're going home. In the face of a lot of consternation, we're just going home. And that reinforces those voices in Iraq that say, again, with a false sense of confidence that I remember vividly from 8 or 9 years ago, that they can handle it. Thanks very much, they can handle it. The country nearly tipped over the abyss into a caliphate 3 years ago, 2 years ago, but memories are short. So we've got the potential for a replay there. And if a motion really gets underway in the Iraqi parliament to get the troops out, I think the president will respond, fine, they're gone. They're gone yesterday.
Thank you.
Rob, very interesting question. And the answer may not be obvious. I say that because, on the one hand, it's not an accident that the last blow-up in November in Gaza, there was a ceasefire. And you had the defense minister, Lieberman, resign. He was against what was done in terms of accepting the ceasefire. He was against money going to Hamas from Qatar. And yet, the decision I think that was made by the prime minister because he also understood a no-win proposition. You get into a war in Gaza, and you're going to lose people. You'll end up inevitably, given the density of Gaza, given the way Hamas has pretty much positioned itself so it has basically civilian hostages. You're going to have a lot of dead Palestinians. And at the end of that, do you want to stay in Gaza? No. But if you leave Gaza, what have you left? Do you have a vacuum there? Who's in control? It is important for Israel to have an address in Gaza. The threat that Israel makes is that the current Hamas leadership could put itself at risk if Israel comes in. The problem is if Israel fulfills that, then who's there? And Israel doesn't want to stay. So on the one hand, if you're Yahya Sinwar, you probably don't want to test the proposition, especially during an election period where the prime minister is going to be criticized if he doesn't do enough. On the other hand, you might probe just to sort of see what the thresholds are. And in the case of Prime Minister Netanyahu, on the one hand, he wants to convey a very tough rhetorical posture that he hopes will be convincing so that it deters anything from happening, whether it's in Gaza or whether it happens in the Northern Front. And yet, in both cases, the last thing he probably wants is to have a conflict that is unlikely to be decisive and is not easy to bring to a conclusion. And there clearly are hints from Hezbollah and from the Iranians that all the resistance would be involved. Even if you had something just erupt in Gaza alone, would that really mean that nothing would happen on the Northern Front? One of the things I learned when I was in Israel is that Hamas now has some people in southern Lebanon. So I think I think all sides realize it's probably not in their interest to have a conflict. And yet, as we've seen before, even though all sides believe it's not in their conflict, sometimes conflict happens anyway.
Okay, thank you. Dana.
So in response to the specific question of is this really all anti-Trump, no, and a little bit of yes. So prior to the Trump administration, I think it would be fair to say in terms of foreign policy voting, members of Congress took the most votes on legislation related to Israel and Iran. But in the last 4 years, they've taken more votes related to Saudi Arabia and Yemen than any other foreign policy issue. A couple examples. At the end of the Obama administration, there was the Justice Against Sponsors for Terrorism Act, JASTA, which would have given American citizens the right to sue Saudi Arabia in U.S. courts for responsibility tied to 9/11. President Obama actually vetoed that bill when it passed both chambers of Congress, and the Senate overrode his veto pre-Trump. Members of Congress also voted on multiple resolutions of disapproval related to weapon sales to Saudi Arabia because of their concern about the application of those weapon systems in Yemen, all before President Trump. In the past year and a half, 2 years of the Trump administration, there were multiple attempts at votes on resolutions related to war powers and withdrawing U.S. forces from engaging in hostilities in Yemen. There were votes on senses of the Senate, senses in the House of Representatives about the conflict in Yemen, the humanitarian situation, more hearings on Yemen and this conflict than probably any other Middle East issue, maybe Syria, and then finally the Khashoggi situation. I would also note that some of the most aggressive voices threatening the entire U.S.-Saudi relationship are not coming from the Democratic side. They're actually coming from the Republican side. And the two that stand out in my mind are Senators Lindsey Graham and Bob Corker, who went on TV, on live TV and said extremely aggressive policy statements about willingness to discard the entire relationship because of what had happened to Mr. Khashoggi. So we're at a place where it is not just about democratic reaction and pushing of this issue. There is bipartisan, bicameral concern, and it is longstanding. And now, because members have taken so many votes on issues related to the U.S.-Saudi relationship, to Saudi Arabia, and to the conflict in Yemen, it means that every time they take those votes, they have staff that are prepping them on the votes, on the context of the votes. They have high-level administration officials calling them, explaining to them why this vote is not in the U.S. interest or contrary to the Trump administration's desires, which means they are educated on these issues. They understand the debates. They understand the pros and cons. So we are at a point where before you could have members of Congress talking to you about the dynamics of the Iran nuclear program. What about this reactor? What about this level of enriched uranium? And now they are conversant enough on these issues related to Saudi Arabia and Yemen. Had the Trump administration taken a different approach earlier with the Khashoggi situation, it might have turned out a little differently. I think that there was, from the 2017 Trump trip to Riyadh, and how perceptions of how the Trump team engaged on the Qatar dispute, all the way to what looked like a knee-jerk defensiveness to protect and not call for immediate transparency and accountability when Mr. Khashoggi disappeared, and then the story out of Riyadh continued to change, that pushed members of Congress to take even more aggressive stance both publicly and legislatively. But again, it was not partisan, and that's what is unique about this period in time. It's bicameral and it's bipartisan.
Very good. Thank you very much. We're going to turn to your questions. I just want to inject an endorsement of what you said earlier about hoping that this next Congress is able to work with the administration to fill all those important vacancies. And there is no more important vacancy than the need to fill the Assistant Secretary for Near East Affairs, Dave Shanker, here, my colleague at the Washington Institute. So, turn to your questions. Yes, Tom down in front, if you just raise your hand, identify to whom you are asking the question. Try to pose only one question and not three in the guise of one.
Rob, that's impossible. Thank you all for your clarity of thought. And Dana, your report I thought was clean, so I want to dirty it up a little bit. You were very clear, but as we all know, there's always a tension in these two institutions, the House and the Senate, between committees and attraction to the administration or not, and personal thinking and personal ambition. Who do you think are going to be the driving forces? And I think you just, in your last answer, you started to get into this, Reich and Imhoff versus Graham. But who else do you think in the Senate? And secondly, we've all known Eliot Engel for over a long period of time. Will he be strong? Will he be weak, mild, meek? Or are there other forces at work, including in the Speaker's office, on foreign policy, security policy making? And basically, where's the institutional basis? Where's the tension, that's quote-unquote struggle between the executive and legislative branch?
So you did get 3 in. That was very impressive. Okay, Dana.
Well, I know better than to make personal comments about specific members of Congress. So first of all, I think we'll start with the Senate side, which I know much better. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee has the potential to be very active in the foreign policy space, but it depends upon whether or not Chairman Risch decides to use the committee that way. A committee is only as good as the hearings it's holding, the willingness of the majority party and the minority party to come together to actually exercise real oversight, to move nominations, to hold business meetings, to actually advance legislation. The indicators from Senator Risch, he gave one interview to PBS NewsHour and another interview in USA Today, and he was quite clear about his intentions, which is not to air disagreements publicly with the Trump administration. That
Been clearer on that subject with the Idaho.
Tom.
There you go. So what he said very clearly is he actually has no intention of holding hearings related to Middle East issues, and that when he has disagreements with the president, he chooses to deal with them privately. There's I think a fundamental view by other members in the Senate, such as my former boss, Ranking Member Bob Menendez of New Jersey, that Congress is a separate and co-equal branch of government, and that it is part of the job of members of Congress to force public debates, both so they are available to the world, but to American voters and constituents, and that's why we have hearings and these sorts of issues. So how that committee plays out, I think remains to be seen. And on the House side, what's quite clear to me is that there is a very large and very new set of members in the Democratic caucus, and Eliot Engel has his work cut out for him based on some of the attention given to new members on his committee as well. And there has always been tensions between what the foreign affairs committees can do versus the armed services committees, because one of those committees passes an authorizing bill every year, and the appropriations committees who actually control the purse strings. And it has been very challenging for either the Senate Foreign Relations Committee or the House Foreign Affairs Committee to pass actual authorizing legislation. So for me, if we're in a hyper-partisan moment where there's not going to be a lot of commitment to bipartisanship in passing standalone pieces of legislation, then the real action is in the Armed Services Committee and in the Appropriations Committees. And the Foreign Relations Committees can hold hearings and exercise oversight by shining a light on boutique issues, or holding up specific weapon sales, or holding up specific pieces of assistance, but that's different from fundamentally passing a piece of legislation or bringing together the entire caucus. So I'm skeptical about what will happen this year.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much. Questions? Just go around the room. Mark, yes? Mark Ginsburg? Who was easily confirmed, I should say, when he came up for
99-0.
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly.
Thank you, Dennis, and thank you, Barbara. I'm going to direct my question to both of you. Neither of you mentioned our Crown Prince and the ultimate deal, and I'm wondering whether or not either of you had any discussions about, shall we say, in Israel and in Saudi Arabia, whether this vaunted great experiment in peacemaking by the Trump administration is going to somehow see the light of day, and what does the light of day look like, particularly in the wake of Secretary Pompeo's speech in Cairo, as well as the fact that we are hearing time and again that the revelation is just around the corner.
So, unlike Dennis, I did not speak with Saudi policy officials in sort of that space. I had engagements with economic officials, but I sort of test around the proposition with all of these private Saudis, many of them who are very well wired into the government, but again, across generational lines, test around the proposition, which we're all familiar with. What about this notion that this convergence of perspective on threat, in particular between Saudi Arabia and Israel, UAE, etc., having shape-shifted, the region having shape-shifted, their perspective having aligned more closely, the deal of the century still being far off in the mists of time, perhaps. Is it possible to imagine a creeping normalization or a sort of a de facto normalization even in the absence of a comprehensive settlement? And I posed that to my 40-something host and his 22-year-old niece over dinner. She said, absolutely not. My generation is very committed to the Palestinian cause. It's a matter of justice. He said, oh, yeah, we should and we can and we should just move ahead. We've got interest there. I got the full gamut, but also got the traditional, yes, we have a relationship that's sort of off camera, but no, we can't bring it, into the light of day until we see those issues wrapped up.
So let me pick up on that, because I heard a lot of the same from kind of the officialdom. I would say it was unmistakable how clearly they were describing the convergence of strategic interest. There was a sense that we face common threats. There was even a sense, and I in some ways link it to a point that we both made at the outset, which is the less reliable the United States is perceived, the more Israel's role becomes more important to them in a de facto sense. So that argues for all sorts of things below the radar screen, not necessarily above the radar screen. I did get a lot of what I would describe as fatigue with the Palestinians, meaning a sense that we make a sacrifice by not being able to do things more overtly with the Israelis, but and that's one we will continue to do because we understand this is still an issue that has resonance and creates a sense of justice or injustice. And what I heard was, when we don't want the Iranians exploiting that. But there was also a sense that very little confidence that the Palestinians will ever respond to anything. And this is where there was a sense of, kind of built into your question as well, that how long should we deny ourselves something that could be in our interest, point one. Point two, there was I heard on a number of occasions that the mood in Saudi Arabia among the public towards Israel is changing. One thing I heard was, when we get attacked by rockets from the Houthis, it makes people more aware of what Israel faces in terms of both Hamas and Hezbollah. Now, no one suggested this was a majority sentiment, but what they were saying was these were attitudes you would not have seen before a few years ago, and you do see them now, so there's a gradual evolution. Still, I would say no readiness to really transform the relationship in a public way, absent some significant move on the Palestinians. Okay, so where does the Trump peace plan come in? There was an expectation in both places, both in Saudi Arabia and Israel, that it would be presented. There was a clear statement that no one knew exactly what was in it, that they have each been briefed on elements of it, and they couldn't draw conclusions based on that. They hadn't seen anything in writing. There was, I would say, on the Saudi side, there was a certain sense that it might be more serious than people think, but they'd have to wait to see it. On the Israeli side, there was a sense that, well, it's coming and we'll see what it is. But nobody on either side pretended that they knew what was actually in it, though they each felt very strongly that it would actually happen.
Okay, very good. Questions? Yes, Dan in the center.
As a person who cares about the relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia, I was intrigued, Dennis, by your comment that we need more transparency in the trial of the killers of Khashoggi. Isn't that something maybe we should be afraid of, transparency, especially if the facts are as everyone supposes them to be? Doesn't transparency lead to more conflict and a more difficult relationship with the Crown Prince?
I make the case for transparency because Saudi Arabia itself says that it has a legal system. It's building an unmistakable rule of law. It doesn't intervene in the legal system. It has a story about the killing and its aftermath. So if they now have a trial where they simply come out, here's what the verdicts were, I'm not sure that is going to accelerate the process of trying to change the relationship here and trying to change the impression or image of Saudi Arabia.
What about my points? Where might it lead?
Well, we'll have to see what it produces.
Okay. Any other questions? Yes, up in front.
Sarah Stern, Endowment for Middle East Truth. In Washington, we all suffer from the disease of bifurcation between blacks and whites, and not in terms of race, but in terms of who's wearing the black hat, who's wearing the white hat. And the Iranians actually lucked out, in a sense, that Khashoggi was Saudi, and there, unfortunately, are human rights abuses allure within the Islamic Republic of Iran. I'm wondering if that had come up at all in their conversations, and whether or not they feel that they are in particular being discriminated against because of this affair.
So the last question was, do they feel if they're discriminated against? But I want to ask you also, more generally, how do Saudis, Gulfies, Israelis see the internal situation in Iran? Do they see that that the Trump administration's effort to impose, tougher sanctions, is it leading to a certain direction, a welcome direction, or are the Iranians sitting back and handling it, and the Iranian ambition continues without the U.S. being able to stop it just through economic means?
Sarah, on your question, the answer absolutely in Saudi Arabia was yes. What I heard was, for example, as terrible as Khashoggi was and what was done, at the same time, the Iranians were trying to kill dissidents in Belgium and in France and in Denmark, and no one was paying any attention to that. And so, yes, there was a very strong sense. What I was describing is kind of the nationalistic backlash. There was a sense we are being singled out, and what Iran is doing is being ignored. One of the points I noted was, well, precisely, this is an interesting reminder of what happens when you take a step like this, because the attention is being riveted on you, not on the Iranians. An answer to your question, Rob, it was interesting. There was in both places, both in Saudi Arabia and in Israel, there was a sense that the Iranians are really being squeezed, and that the pressures are rising. There was also a perception that a belief that the Iranians would try to outlast the Trump administration, so they didn't see them at this point moving in a different direction, although what they do feel is each felt that the Iranians have become more aggressive in the region in response to the pressures, that these pressures have not led them to somehow look for ways to limit what they're doing. There was a hope that somehow these pressures could lead to a change. I think in Saudi Arabia, I felt they were more hopeful that you could see a change, but they didn't have high expectations it would be soon. In Israel, what I heard was that there is a debate in Iran going on, in no small part because the costs are high. The debate was portrayed, I'm just for simplicity's sake, I'll just say it was portrayed in terms of Soleimani against Rouhani. And between those who saw this is not the time for us to be doing things that will actually raise the cost to us, versus those who felt that doing more now was a way to show the consequences of putting pressure on Iran. So yes, there was a sense that the Iranians were feeling it. There was a sense that they could probably endure for the time being. I think the Saudis were a little bit more hopeful that it might have an effect on them sooner rather than later, but both expected that they would try to outlast the Trump administration.
Barbara?
I would add to that the Saudis, the private sector, private Saudis, by and large, really weren't thinking much about or had Iran much on their minds. They were very consumed with their own internal churn, and to that issue, were very sensitive about the battering they're getting, mostly in terms of look. But one young woman said, "It's really too bad that these arrests had to happen along with the reform." But she put it that way. It's sort of, we're doing this reform. People went too far in asking too much from the bottom up. They have to understand it's coming from the top down at a measured pace. They were asking too much. It's too bad these arrests had to happen. So awareness, indeed, that this sort of stuff is going on. Strict adherence to the party line that the Crown Prince had nothing to do with the murder, that these were bad folks, that he had surrounded himself. Sort of awkward silence on the issue of, yeah, but who set the command environment for these folks to think it was normal to brutally kill somebody for dissent. But in the official contacts I've had over, say, the last 6 weeks, both in Saudi Arabia and outside it, with Gulf officials, there's a jarring juxtaposition for them of the abrupt decision to pull troops out of Syria, which is supposedly where we are trying to do a couple different things. Yes, fight ISIS, but also do a blocking action or pressure or denial or what have you vis-a-vis Iran's project. How does that square with the policy that's going to drive Iran every boot out of Syria, et cetera? And I think, much as they're all boosters of the sanctions, they're beginning to say, and we heard this here this week, yeah, but what else? Because the sanctions won't do it. It won't happen fast enough.
All right, with that, we're going to have to call today's session to a close. In addition to Barbara, Dennis, and Dana, I hope you take a look at the range of expertise at the Institute. So many topics we didn't get a chance to talk about today, from Turkey to really post-Assad or the next phase in Syria to Egypt, across the Middle East. But to get a glimpse of where 2019 is going to go, I'm really delighted that Barbara, Dennis, and Dana were able to give us signposts along the road for those of you who know the Middle East reference. Thank you very much for joining us at the Washington Institute.
You managed? You were good?